Hello there. So, welcome to the second lecture. So, this lecture is about critical thinking. And what is critical thinking? So, basically, critical thinking is all about asking questions. That's basically what it is. Now, critical thinking comprises of three main things. One, critical. Excuse me. Critical means it comes from the word crine, which means to choose, selective, and to inquire. Basically, is to ask questions. One of the earliest process of the creative thinking process is asking questions, really. And the second part is intellectual, means working in your mind. You got to do some thinking. There's a thinking process, of course. And of course, there's virtue, means good qualities, and the value, right? It's all about value. Now, when you get confused, basically you need to ask questions. Now, why is it important to ask questions? Because when you ask questions, you engage in thinking, and you decide. Then you will somehow find the root cause of the particular problem. Now, questioning is important to identify what the problems are. Now, there are three types of typical thinkers. Thinking process is very important, but sometimes we find it a bit difficult to sometimes it's difficult to to determine how do we what kind of attitude to have when you want to do a proper thinking process. Now, in critical thinking, as a designer, like I said, the creative process is really creativity is an attitude. So there are three types of archetypes or types of attitude that you might come across when you have this critical thinking. To find the right way. To find the right direction, or the right kind of behavior. With the three different archetypes. So you got the naive Bob archetype, like, and selfish Julia, and a sound mind John. Now, these three character archetypes represents the type of attitude that either prevents you from having the right value in the aspects of questioning, or looking into investigations and things like that, or either a good value in the process of critical thinking. Now, it's important to understand this, because if you're one of those people, then you know that you have to engage in some form of maybe you got to change your approach to critical thinking. Now, naive Bob says he doesn't need to think. Now, naive Bob is one person that he rather, he just go along with whatever. Anyone tells him what to do, he just does it. Okay, you can read this text, you can tell that he doesn't like to think for himself. He just doesn't want to take any risk. He's one of those person that does that, so everybody else does the work for him, and there you go. Now, selfish Julia is one of those person that she likes to believe whatever she wants to think, and she think whenever she wants and whatever she wants. She doesn't want anyone to think for her or give her any opinions about herself and things like that. She just wants things to go only her way, according to her standards. She makes everything about her. That's the kind of attitude. Now, naive Bob and selfish Julia both basically created a whole fence around them, and their critical thinking process is not is a little bit problematic because selfish Julia makes it all about her. She's manipulative. She doesn't, I mean, whatever it is, isolate. I mean, the result of her style isolates her from everything else. Chances are she will get left behind. Yeah. Either that or she manipulates everybody else and then she lacks original thought. Now, when it comes to naive Bob, problematic as well. He has no originality whatsoever. He will lack the kind of fluency of ideas that's coming out of him. So these two problematic. Now, when it comes to Sound Mind John, ideally, he's the kind of person who does he thinks, but he wants to generate a better thing. He wants to generate better ways to think or better solutions, or he wants to be a better thinker himself. Now, he may not be the best. He may not be a high achiever, right? Sound Mind John may not be a high achiever because he makes mistakes too, but he's constructive. Solving problems is easy because he knows he has to make more attempts to do that. If he doesn't make the attempt, then he may not be able to practice his thinking. Now, he's the kind of person like to put his thoughts to practice, and he's not selfish because he's willing to work with others, and he's one of those people that likes to collaborate. So, but he's also not gullible. He doesn't always believe everything he sees and hears. Now, he also questions what he sees and hears. He doesn't want to often believe everything what everybody says just like that. He doesn't go with the flow all the time. And sometimes people like him can be a little bit unpopular, you know. So he wants to learn things for himself. He wants to learn for himself, and he wants to make his own decisions, but he also critically questions his own decisions and reflects on his decisions as well. Now, this is the ideal attitude. Now, if you notice the three individual archetypes, the third part of the creative thinking process is to do with the virtue of critical thinking, which means having sound mind and rationality and good values. Yeah. So it has the set of skills that three main set of skills called. One is the inquiry skill, and of course the understanding and evaluation skills, being able to reflect on what has happened, reflect on things that went wrong, even reflect on things that worked. So, and there's also the advocacy skills, the ability to formulate positions and support them in a manner that promotes reasoned discussion. So, being able to talk about something is important. Sometimes debates are very important as well. So, is better than violence, right? So, critical thinking is important to practice. Having the good values, because if you engage in good discussion, then I think people will be able to understand each other better, right? So you don't always need to always agree. Sometimes you may disagree, but at least you engage in a discussion. So the Paul Elder model of critical thinking, for example, you can actually look at this article. There are three areas. There's good reasoning, okay, that this model talks about good reasoning, intellectual standards, and again intellectual traits. Now this is consistent with the three main points that you saw earlier in the slide. Now how do you one of the things about creative thinking also, some of the traits, some of the things that often this is discussed in the creative thinking workflow or process is specific questions, and your questions have to be very much aligned with certain categories of need, or certain categories that will guide you, guidelines, specific guidelines. For example, like this, there are 5 different guidelines here. There's clarity, accuracy, precision, relevance, and depth. Now these are, whenever you ask questions, these questions must be guided. So these 5 guidelines, 5 main category of the guidelines to accuracy of questioning is important. Now, one of the first steps of the creative thinking process is to ask. And one of the things that, of course, you need to understand who your users are for the design. So therefore, you will have to ask questions to the users. And it's important to ask the right questions, because if you ask the wrong questions, you may not get the right clarity. Get it? So it's important for you to identify the right questions. So here you can see a list of questions. For example, could you elaborate further? It's like probing. You can probe questions. You can probe your users. What is it that will make it easy? For example, trying to define the problem even further. Can you illustrate what you mean? Can you check on that? Precision. Can you be more specific? Things like that. So if you ask some of these questions, you're probably going to get some very right answers. They are probing questions. Sometimes they can be either open-ended questions, or they're a specific question. So these guidelines are very important for you, especially when you're going to conduct interviews or semi-formal interviews to users, or you want to do some data collection. Just remember what are the right questions to ask. And there's also other categories. For example, do you need to look at it from different perspective? In this slide, we show four more categories to guide your questioning. Breadth is about horizontal, or breadth is like how wide can your questioning go? That means how much elaboration do you need? Other perspectives, points of views, etc. Logic, does it make sense? 1 + 1 = 2. You need to put 2 and 2 together. Significance, how significant is it? Like, what's the most important problem to consider? What's the emphasis? And then there's fairness. Do I have a vested interest in this? Am I sympathetically representing the viewpoints of others? There are questions. So you're looking at it again, looking at different angles as well. Now, it's also the intellectual process. So these earlier was the good reasoning, the reasoning skills when you want to ask the right questions. Then, of course, you have the intellectual process. I know I use Megamind. It's got a big mind. So that's all. And when it comes to intellectual process, is getting data from asking questions is one thing, but then how do you process it? So what are these intellectual traits and virtues? What is this that's to do with thinking process? Intellectual integrity, what does that mean? It means I try to be the person I expect others to be. For example, that's intellectual integrity. So the intellectual process is again reflective and reflexive to the entire understanding of critical thought. Intellectual humility, you don't always know everything. So these intellectual process is connected to these good values. So there's good values to understand, to consider during your intellectual thought. Then you also have accuracy and relevance, that will give you more confidence. And then you have better to stick to the problem rather than to give up, right? And keep trying to figure it out. So you don't give up probing and trying to find out until you have exhausted all your effort to find out. Fair-mindedness, consider others' perspective, other points of view as well, what other people think about it, and so on. And intellectual courage, that you have to be ready to speak up for what you think is right. Speaking up for what you think is right is not lying. It's not making things up. You are just making a statement. For example, I don't know. You don't always know. When somebody were to ask a question like, can you be more specific about this and whatever, then maybe you, to reply that, you have to say, if you don't know, if you know only two things, I only know two things that happened there, and these are specific things. The rest I cannot tell you because I don't know. So saying that you don't know is not something to be ashamed of. And saying something that is the truth can also be kind of difficult. But if there's a truth, then say the truth. But if you think the truth, it is the right time to say the truth, then say it. Usually, telling the truth is very important. The truth of that particular issue, that problem, will probably help you design that product much better. So, what is a truth? How do you define that truth? Now, truth in research, you also call it paradigm, a sense of truth. So this sense of truth has to be something that drives you to make certain statement or speak up. Think about it. Yeah. Intellectual empathy, trying to understand other people's thinking. Yeah. Always consider what others are thinking as well. Intellectual autonomy. I must do my own thinking to decide and what to believe. So you don't always need to believe what everybody says. You don't always need to follow the crowd. You got to decide for yourself. If you decide to follow. If you don't decide to follow, then don't. But you must have a good reason for it. So these are some of the intellectual traits. It's part of the intellectual process, and this is connected to virtues and value of the intellectual process. Now, all these things to be considered when you are probing and asking questions, or somebody is asking a question to you. There are some of the things that you have in order to be more effective, or to be a more effective critical thinker. Yeah. Now, if you put this to the test, sometimes you can, you're the kind of person that starts to question what you see. Then there's some set of pictures that I have here in the slides. They can be a little disturbing, but they're intentionally there to provoke your sense of questioning. Obviously, when these slides are presented in class, a lot of these things can be done, within the session itself. But if you're watching this as a video, you can practice asking those questions by yourself. But you can ask me as well. For example, looking at a poster of this, and children would put anything in their mouth, and what do you think the children do you think do you think something like this is effective, that prevented people from bringing the dogs to the park? Think about it. What about this? This is terrible. But I wouldn't immediately. I was about to respond and say it is terrible, but I shouldn't immediately respond that way, being overly critical and emotional about it. But I must first make my observation and ask some of these specific questions just to get clarity, to understand the significance of this. So once you've understood it and then you've got enough data, then you jump to a conclusion. Remember, let me backtrack a little bit. Yeah, remember this? Good reasoning. Why was this there? Good reasoning, intellectual standard, quality. Good reasoning and quality of our reasoning that you can see when is probably the answers to some of these questions. How does, when you look at all these questions, you can use these questions to check on what you're seeing, okay? Looking at all these guidelines and categories. These are the guidelines to getting good reason and good information out of what you're seeing and guiding your questioning. Then you have all this in order to, before you make any judgment, you have to give yourself a check, okay, then looking at all these intellectual traits and values and virtues, then when you look at this, think about yourself. So you think about yourself, reflect on this, and what do you think? How do you think you will put your questions, or form your questions, or formulate your questions when you see something like this? You got to practice doing this, because very often we like to criticize first before thinking. But now let's reverse the process. Think first before criticizing. It's not that simple, is it? It's not that simple. Even this, I think in class everybody will be gasping like, oh my goodness, oh wow, we gasp and get shocked so easily, but the reality it's there, and maybe we should ask some questions about it first before gasping and before reacting. So it's the two things, isn't it? We react first and then ask questions. But we're humans. Humans can react. But we're going to have to calm down and think first. So it's often, it's sometimes easier said than done. But sometimes when you're in the moment, we really realize at some point that the moment we put our thinking caps on, and we learn to formulate our critical thinking better, and we become better critical thinkers, I'm telling you one thing, you can probably solve a lot more things. Yeah. So flat earth, who believes in it? UFOs, okay, how do you question this? What about ads that mislead the eye? Okay, I'm not going to get into that, but I bet we could discuss that in class. And what about very controversial diesel ads like this that has certain innuendos? What about something like this? Who is the real man, and why? What about something like this? How would you question something like that? Would you need to question it? Yeah, does it work? And so on. What about this? What is the kind of design statement this United Colors of Benetton is communicating to us? What about this kind of ads? How does that work as well? So think about it. Whatever you see, you should be able to question it. No harm in that. Yeah. So how about this? Is there anything there you want to leave out or include? Or is it true that racists have no brains? What about this? Oh my gosh. Right? This was an actual ad that was very controversial. And see, the soap company actually apologized. So what about Happy Tree Friends? It's a cartoon show, but some of you find this entertaining. But instead of reacting, why can't we just try to understand why is it entertaining? Now, why is there such a good use of color? and that's the reason why we will have little interesting class activities when it comes to critical thinking. For example, who is the better designer, Batman or Iron Man? So what do you think? Now, think for yourself. Hope this second lecture, I guess, makes a little sense to you. But I hope you got something out of this. It's very basic, and I think I hope you find this useful. So we're not doing this live video, but thank you very much for paying attention to this whole video. Take care now, and I'll see you in class.